The 20th century was a time of incredible change, unspeakable horrors, and amazing leaps of scientific discovery. It was a century marked by events that united and divided us, from great feats to great wars, with advancements and setbacks that showed us the power of many, the power of one.
I have a dream.
A century of revolutions, evolutions, and retributions. A century made by conflicts and crimes, inventions and entertainment, politics, protests, discoveries, and disasters.
Oh, humanity.
We will count down the 101 events of the 20th century. Their stories form the tapestry of our history and shape the world in which we live. In this episode,
it entirely changed the way that Hollywood went about making money from merchandising.
People were searching for precedents. Where had there ever been mass suicides comparable to this?
So it just shows you how one determined person with a powerful idea can change the world.
an ink drawing of a cartoon mouse in 1928 was the first spark in an idea that would create a wonderland delighting millions of children and adults throughout the latter half of the 20th century. Illustrator Walt Disney and animator Ub Iwerks created Steamboat Willie, the first all-sound cartoon in 1928. Its star was originally called Mortimer Mouse, but Walt's wife and fellow ink artist Lillian thought Mickey sounded better. Mickey was soon followed by Donald Duck, Minnie Mouse and Goofy, all becoming beloved characters in their own right.
The name of Walt Disney through his cartoon characters has meant family entertainment for young and old alike.
Walt was always challenging himself, never resting on his laurels. When his motion picture and television programs became successful, he felt a desire to branch out.
The earliest kind of documentation that we see of Disney kind of planning for an amusement park was around about 1948, and he really didn't like the kinds of theme parks that were available to families at that time. He thought they were kind of dirty and grimy, and he said that they weren't a very kind of nice atmosphere for family outings. And he came up with this kind of new idea.
Now we want you to share with us our latest and greatest dream. That's it, right here. Disneyland.
In it, he imagined flying elephants and giant teacups, a fairy tale castle, rockets, and a scenic railway. On the 17th of July, 1955, Walt's biggest venture opened to the public, Disneyland. Many thought the park was doomed to failure.
Opening week for Disneyland was actually a bit of a disaster. They had all sorts of problems. There were a lot of forged tickets, so it was overcrowded. It was particularly embarrassing for the Disney company because a lot of the opening week for Disneyland was broadcast live on television.
After a slightly bumpy start, it was a huge success, sparking an entire new industry, theme parks. By the end of the 20th century, hundreds of millions have visited Disneyland.
What Disneyland stands for, I suppose, the Disneyland that Walt built in Anaheim, California. It's very much a kind of utopian version of America.
The Golden West, it is delightfully commemorated today in the old-time streets of Disneyland.
Why I think it endures and why people go there is to be part of that dream world.
The happiest place on earth was followed by Disney World in Florida in 1971, Tokyo Disney in 1983, and Paris Euro Disney in 1992. Walt said that Disneyland would never be completed as long as there was imagination left in the world. The statement becoming a template for new ideas and attractions continually added. The promise he had made at the park's opening in 1955 had come true.
To all who come to this happy place, Welcome. Here age relives fond memories of the past, and here youth may savor the challenge and promise of the future.
In 1936, the military leadership of Spain staged a coup against the Republic's coalition government. It failed, but the army kept fighting, setting off a war that created ripples beyond Spain's borders. Spain had only been a democratic republic for 5 years when civil war broke out. History labels the military and the right wing as the nationalists, and the forces backing the legitimate government as the Republicans.
Neither side seems to have a distinctive uniform, but these are government men.
The decisive military force that joined the fighting was the Army of Africa from the Spanish colony of Morocco. It was led by Francisco Franco.
And Franco's arrival in power was a brilliantly orchestrated exercise in manipulation. He arranged that certain generals would support him, that they managed to push others to the side and so forth. And by a sudden announcement, Franco was proclaimed leader.
But General Franco has arrived on very special business, and it is with dictator-like tread that the new head of the state reviews his guard of honor.
Very quickly, each side took their strongholds. The Republicans took Catalonia and its capital, Barcelona, among other cities. They had limited help from the Soviet Union. By contrast, the nationalists received material and personnel from Germany and Italy. Although the nationalist forces were better supplied, they held back on the attack. Franco's approach to the war was patient and reserved.
But at the same time, Franco had another agenda, and that was by making it a slow war, he was able to suppress all opposition. It was during this particular period that the nationalists, who might have been in a minority in areas with great Republican sympathies, were able to crush, if necessary, kill any of their opponents.
The war was slow to progress, each side holding on to their areas.
Less than 60 miles divide the fascists from the Spanish capital, where in the Guadarrama mountain range, government troops and militiamen grimly defend the strong points.
But the Popular Front was hopelessly divided. Its factions fought each other on the streets of Madrid, making it easy for the nationalists to finally take the city without much of a fight on April the 1st, 1939. World War II followed closely on the heels of the Spanish Civil War's end. And it was time for Spain to pay its debts, even if it would hurt her people.
Franco knew that the end of the Spanish Civil War, that Spain was completely exhausted and, above all, economically crushed. He owed Hitler a huge amount. As a result, all Spanish exports were all virtually being given to Germany to pay for Germany's contribution, both in arms and in military contributions.
The nationalist victory of 1939 destroyed the Republican side of politics, which was slow to recover even after Franco's death in 1975.
The ruin of the flourishing town of 75,000 inhabitants shows the cost of revolution.
The 1930s saw a war of ideals in Spain. National secrecy replaced remembrance and restricted the tale to the version of the victors. The shadow of the Civil War would lie over Spain for generations to come. In 1986, a catastrophic accident in a Ukrainian nuclear power station created a radioactive cloud that spread across Europe and turned the area into one of the 20th century's most infamous ghost towns. The world's first nuclear power plant was put into operation in Obninsk near Moscow in 1954. The experimental water-cooled plant was built to produce atomic energy that could be harnessed for electricity generation and transport needs.
The Soviet Union, which included Ukraine in those days, had a very pro-nuclear power policy. There was a degree of hubris, I think. This was supposed to be the top technology in the top technological country in the world, according to Soviet propaganda. And as a result, they pursued a design that had been rejected by every other country in the world.
Despite protests around the world, the nuclear industry grew rapidly in Europe and Russia during the 1970s and 80s. That changed after an accident at Russia's Chernobyl plant in April 1986. On the evening of the 26th of April, the plant's safety systems were turned off during a late-night test.
So power went from about 6% of normal operating to about 480 times normal operating within about 3 seconds. There was a huge hydrogen explosion. The pile cap, the 2,000-ton metal cap over the top of the reactor, was flipped up into the air like a coin, and the reactor core was exposed, so a very large amount of material could escape.
The accident would have a devastating effect.
In terms of the radioactive fallout, there were about 30 deaths on site. About another 250 people suffered from radiation sickness. The longer-term effects were the thyroid cancers in the area. Because of radioactive iodine in the plume, this was taken up in thyroids of local people.
Vast tracts of Ukrainian farmland lie contaminated, and the effect on Chernobyl's community will be felt for generations.
Fires from the explosion created updrafts of radioactive material which travelled across the European continent for more than a week. Yet Soviet authorities failed to notify any other governments of the incident.
Soviet officials have blamed the catastrophe on human negligence.
It was only when nuclear particles were detected in Sweden that the outside world became aware of the disaster.
The Soviets tell the world what really happened at the Chernobyl nuclear reactor disaster in April. And the Scandinavians are only now beginning to realize the whole cost to wildlife in Northern Europe.
Then there had been attempts to cover up the accident once it had occurred, even from the Soviet high command. I suspect that it was a significant issue in the breakup and collapse of the communist system.
As a result of the accident, global confidence in nuclear power plummeted. The nuclear power industry went into deep recession in the 1990s. For decades after the accident, Chernobyl's reactor has sat in its concrete sarcophagus, a reminder of the potential cost of nuclear power.
There is agreement, however, on both sides of the nuclear argument post-Chernobyl. It must never happen again.
(1936) brought upheaval to the British royal family. With the death of King George V, his unwilling eldest son would have to ascend the throne. Prince Edward's personal life would lead to a crisis neither Parliament nor the British people knew how to handle.
In the sad bereavement which we all feel so deeply at the death of our late beloved king, what consolation it is to know that a son worthy of his father has succeeded to the throne.
Edward wasn't ready to be king when the moment came. He was popular with the public and with the ladies.
As Prince of Wales, Edward VIII was one of the celebrity figures of really the Western world. He thoroughly enjoyed partying, he thoroughly enjoyed being photographed, and as part of that, he became somebody who everybody wanted to meet.
Edward met Mrs. Wallace Simpson at one of these parties, and they would continue to meet again and again as she too enjoyed the extravagant lifestyle.
She attracted him by being informal, American, not apparently overawed by his status, and as a result, she caught his interest, and the rest is history.
As their relationship developed, concern grew. It was not just that she had to be titled. As the head of the Church of England, the king was not allowed to marry someone who had been divorced, and Mrs. Simpson had been divorced twice.
The king holds that marriage is his own private affair, and he's strong-willed and determined.
Mrs. Simpson was not accepted by the royal family, or the country's parliament, or the public, who could not understand their king's infatuation.
You have a picture where Edward VIII is actually increasingly isolated, increasingly backed into a corner, where in many ways he feels there is no option but to stick to his word. If Wallace Simpson was a non-negotiable factor in his life, then the only thing that he could negotiate was the terms on which he would go.
In the gloom of a dull December afternoon, Mr. Baldwin leaves Downing Street to tell Parliament the fateful news of the King's decision.
After 10 months, Edward VIII abdicated the throne to marry his sweetheart. His reign, the shortest for 380 years, ended on December the 11th, 1936, with his now famous broadcast to the British people.
I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to, without the help and support of the woman I love.
On Edward's abdication, his younger brother Albert was crowned George VI, and he gave his brother the title of the Duke of Windsor. But Wallis did not become a royal duchess, nor was she allowed to attend royal ceremonies. The Windsors lived abroad away from the royal family. Edward's abdication was their first voluntary abdication in the history of the British monarchy, and it shocked the British people.
What Edward VIII's choice of wife showed is that no member of the royal family could ignore public opinion when it comes to choosing a consort. That they will be scrutinized, they will be commented on, positively and negatively.
The early years of the space race were characterized by competition between Russia and the United States. As this competition gave way to cooperation, humankind would achieve a remarkable feat.
If it is our destiny to explore, which I believe it is, then the International Space Station is the next step.
Zarya, the first piece of a new International Space Station, was launched in 1988.
There was a Russian module, and its purpose was simply to get things started. It wasn't a habitable part of the station. It contained some of the essential systems for the eventual station, including things like navigation and communications, but it wasn't pressurised, it wasn't a habitable space for a human being in orbit.
As the initial piece, Zarya set the orbit for the following pieces of the space station. It was connected to the first node called Unity on the 6th of December 1998. Later, two more nodes, named Harmony and Tranquility, completed the space station.
I think the Russian space technology is very good, and people here know how to design things to meet a requirement. And the station will be flyable for 15 years.
On the 2nd of November 2000, the first inhabitants of the structure arrived. Yuri Gidzenko, Sergei Krikalev, and William Shepard were the first to live on the station.
I'd like to give a big thanks to all the people on the ground in Russia, the United States, and all the partner countries that have worked long and hard to make this possible.
The station is equipped for long periods of human habitation.
There's a privacy door on the bathroom, obviously, to make sure that everybody can have their own moments alone.
The project is a collaboration between 16 countries, involving scientific laboratories from Japan, Europe, and the US. They were able to work on problems from the unique perspective of space.
The space station is used for quite an incredible range of research. It's basically a scientific platform, and so there are many experiments in biology, in microgravity. There are experiments in astronomy. There are experiments in communications.
Since it was first manned, the space station has produced numerous innovations in medicine, improving space travel technology, and water sanitation.
The Expedition 19 crew inaugurating the use of the water recovery system to produce recycled, purified water.
The space station is unique in allowing public input into research programs, conducting experiments suggested from all over the Earth.
International Space Station is all about cooperation, and it's demonstrated, despite all of the tensions in the world, all of the conflicts and arguments, it's been possible to construct together the most amazing piece of technology And in the process, I think mankind has become better.
For hundreds of years, mankind was not aware of the damage they caused to their environment. Yet as technology advanced in the 20th century, some scientists began to become aware of the negative effects, and they would try to inform the rest of the world. Scientist and novelist Rachel Carson had been trying to tell the world about the harmful effects of the miracle chemical dichlorodiaphenyl trichloroethane, known as DDT. When she published her book, Silent Spring, in 1962, she finally caught the world's attention.
In the United States, prior to Silent Spring, the dominant attitude was one of technological mastery over nature. Nature was there as a set of resources for the exploitation by man. So Silent Spring and Rachel Carson really were a fundamental shock to the system.
DDT had come into use during the Second World War. It was used for fighting disease-carrying mosquitoes in order to aid the advance of American forces, saving countless lives from malaria.
Everyone had to be dusted with DDT powder before they could cross the bridge into the city.
However, its long-term effects were not known. Scientists noted the detrimental effect that could already be seen in birds' eggs. The shells were thinner, which reduced survival of the young. Carson's book drew attention to the plight of the birds and all living things.
And I think it appealed to a sense in many people that they hadn't articulated or really brought to the conscious mind that, yeah, the birds have gone. What is this? This is a tragic thing to do. We love birds, we love nature, but we're destroying it.
Silent Spring was as poetic as it was scientific, and Carson's words reached her readers, connecting the danger to themselves and to their environment.
Yet another menace lies in the crop dusting, which is so much a part of American farming. The perils of DDT, for example, are now well enough known for the US Secretary of Health to call for its complete elimination.
The book was initially received very well, until the makers and distributors of DDT started to fight back.
The chemical industries themselves attacked Rachel Carson as a hysterical woman, despite the fact that she was exceptionally well qualified.
Despite the debate, after the book's publication, there have been significant advances in environmental policy. By 1972, the domestic sale of DDT was banned.
And we've discontinued all use of DDT.
But the compound was still being sold to other countries, and at the close of the 20th century, it was still being made in China and India. Rachel Carson's book may not have had the effect she was looking for, but it set the stage for those to come.
Because Silent Spring named the beast, as it were, it was in many respects the seed that was planted that grew into the modern environment movement in the United States. So it just shows you how one determined person with a powerful idea expressed eloquently can change the world.
In the 1970s, one religious cult gained a following with the promise of a brighter future, but their story would ultimately end in tragedy.
In the 1970s, there was a proliferation of what were then called new religious movements, sects, cults, because there seemed to be a general disenchantment with religion and a searching for meaning elsewhere.
Some found new meaning in the People's Temple. Its young preacher, Jim Jones, assisted in attracting hundreds of people over the 70s.
Just a warm fellowship and acceptance of all people.
And of course, people bought into that religion to such an extent that they were prepared to follow him all the way to South America.
In 1977, Jones escaped the bad press that was coming out about him. Taking 1,000 people with him from the United States, to the small South American country of Guyana. The cult continued into 78, its conditions worsening.
Where before he had ruled with love and understanding, he began to say, the people don't understand love, we've got to rule with fear.
Drugs made Jones increasingly paranoid, and few people were allowed to leave the compound. In November 1978, Congressman Leo Ryan visited the compound and pierced Jones's charade. However, when Ryan tried to take members back to America with him, he was attacked, escaping to the airport where Jones's lieutenants shot and killed him, and 4 others trying to board the plane.
I hit the deck, I lie face down, and next thing I heard, they walking towards us, one of the men. And next thing I know, the guy came close and blew his brain off.
Jones panicked and convinced his congregation that the US government would kill them for the involvement in the crime.
At some point, he decided the time was for the whole cult to disappear by their own hand. He gathered them and gave them all a drink, a concoction that contained cyanide, a lethal dose. Some of them, we understand, drank it voluntarily. The ones that didn't drink it voluntarily were at gunpoint and were forced to swallow.
It's believed each lived about 5 minutes.
Children made up 1/3 of the 900+ victims of Jones's paranoia. Their bodies were found laid in lines around the center of the compound. Jones's body slumped in a throne at the front, with a bullet wound in his head.
People were searching for precedents. Where had there ever been mass suicides comparable to this? And they didn't readily spring to mind.
Jonestown had become a utopian idea, but its power-hungry leader brought the dysfunctional cult to a disastrous end. Its members had believed Jones's word and trusted his vision, following the crazed minister into a mass suicide that shocked the world. Women's fashions come and go with the seasons. But throughout most of the 20th century, when hemlines went up, they made headlines. As more women began entering the workforce, the world came to the realization that long skirts were simply not practical.
Time was when the big designers ordained a fashion line as firm as the Rock of Gibraltar. The height of a skirt was as firmly fixed in the public mind as all the other major events in the British way of life.
Hemlines started to get higher and didn't stop until they reached the highest heights of the miniskirt introduced in 1964.
The early 60s was still older women were in control of dress at that stage. There was a number of things happening. There were a lot of subcultures and they were all rebelling against the previous generation.
The woman who introduced the miniskirt to London was Mary Quant.
She put the quant in quantity and she put quality into ready-to-wear fashion.
It is Mary Quant that takes off with it. She was trying to resist the previous generation and trying to shock people.
She was not the first to make this fashion suggestion. French designer André Courrege's short skirt had met with shocked silence at his 1964 Spring-Summer fashion show. However, Quant was in a better position to capitalise on the miniskirt with clever marketing and her shop's location in swinging London.
Take 15 girls all wearing miniskirts and invite them to break a world record held by a college group in America.
The scandalous length was a statement from the young who were determined to have their say in the 60s.
I think it's giving women confidence and it shows the rise of women's position in society. Going from World War II, where they work in the factories, they were sent back home, and here was outrageous clothing, you could reassert yourself. And that's why I think it's so important as a social statement.
That same year, the miniskirt enjoyed controversy amongst the Melbourne Cup's conservative crowd. Model Jean Shrimpton arrived late, without stockings, gloves or a hat, and a short dress which made the headlines. Shrimpton may have been out of place in 1965, but Ascot of 1966 followed her example, raising the stakes by at least another inch.
This year's Ascot eye-opener wasn't the girl in the trouser suit. It was the follow-up to Jean Shrimpton's dramatic appearance at the races in Australia. It was the invasion of this hallowed shrine of the establishment by the Highline hemline.
Always responding to the politics of the day, in the 1970s, hemlines dropped again. With feminism and protests against the Vietnam War, the young women of the world wore longer skirts against exploitation. With that move, the miniskirt fell out of fashion. But it kept coming back over the second half of the century.
I believe it was one of the first democratic dresses for the 20th century. In fact, democratic for women's clothing, because so many more women could have access to this clothing. They could make it themselves. It was accessible to far more people.
It was rebranded with leather and denim for punks. Then later it became sportswear in the cheerleaders' rah-rah pleated miniskirt. Through its many iterations over the 20th century, the miniskirt remained a symbol of freedom and liberation. By the end of World War II, Europe lay in ruins. The United States, determined to prevent the cycle of revenge and reparation that had followed the First World War, hatched an ambitious recovery plan.
The shattered wreckage of conquered Germany is a graphic symbol of the desperate need of reconstruction in post-war Europe.
By the end of the Second World War, destruction was rife across Europe.
From the United States' point of view, Europe was in rather bad shape at the same time as which the Soviet Union had manifested itself as unremittingly hostile. And there was real fears that it would trample over Western Europe. So, how do you make Europe strong enough to be able to stand in some sort against the Soviet Union? First of all was the need to build some sort of political and economic barrier against the Soviet Union.
On the 5th of June 1947, US Secretary of State George C. Marshall outlined an ambitious economic program. It featured a US-sponsored program to rehabilitate the economies of 17 European nations.
In order to meet this emergency, I recommend that you give immediate and urgent consideration to a bill authorizing the appropriation of sufficient funds to provide the supplies necessary to permit the people of these countries to continue to eat, to work, and to survive the winter.
The idea was that Britain, for example, would need 300 pounds worth of coal. So coal would be provided, not that they would be given money.
Marshall approached the US Congress in 1948 with the idea. Seeking a commitment of billions of dollars, he was adamant this was in the USA's interest as much as Europe's.
The United States, after the Second World War, was in such a productive mode, not only in steel mills, but also on farms, that the fear was if they couldn't sell these goods, it would go into a massive depression. So they needed to build up Europe to be rich enough to be able to buy American goods.
After strong debate, the US Congress passed the Economic Cooperation Act in April 1948, approving over $12 billion to rebuild Western Europe.
President Truman signs the bill that puts the Marshall Aid Plan into operation. Aid for free nations to remain free.
Russia and its Eastern Communist satellite states were invited to participate. However, the Soviets were suspicious of American economic imperialism.
The Americans said, we want to know what your economies are like. In other words, permission to crawl all over your economies and say what you need. And the Soviets weren't having this. And they forced all of their satellites also to turn down Marshall Aid.
When the program rolled out in April 1948, the priority was for food and fuel. Rapidly, in the period that followed, European chemical, engineering and steel industries grew. Over its 4 years, the Marshall Plan was a success. Employment rose, and life began to be more than just surviving day by day.
This is the hour to rededicate ourselves as we face the challenge of the years ahead.
The Marshall Plan had set the continent on the path towards a unified Europe.
Besides reputation as a great, generous gesture by the United States that ought to be done again, Europe is the major outcome. The United States forced Europe as a price for Marshall aid to unify. And without this American pressure, without America midwifing this united Europe, I don't believe it would exist today, certainly not in the way it does.
With the United States economy booming in the 1920s, two captains of the automotive industry, Walter Chrysler and John Jacob Raskob of General Motors, pitted wits and wealth in their efforts to scrape the sky. As the second decade of the 20th century drew to a close, the race was on in New York to erect the world's tallest building.
At the time that they were being built, there was a kind of intense race to build a 1,000-foot skyscraper. That was kind of the be-all and end-all in terms of towers in Manhattan at the time. And if you could build the tallest building in Manhattan, well, you built the tallest building in the world.
Chrysler was the first to break ground in September 1928. Undeterred, Raskob began construction in March 1930.
The Empire State Building was being built at one rate, I think 14 floors every 10 days, really, really fast, just kind of flying up.
Already, she's higher than any other building in the world, and when she's finished, she'll be 102 stories.
They managed to do it by thinking of the whole place as a production line. Workers knew exactly when was coming at what time, so it was very efficiently planned.
At the end of May 1930, the Chrysler Building opened on Lexington Avenue, towering 282 metres high. Raskob pushed on, and with 3,400 workers putting in more than 7 million man-hours, work was completed in just 1 year and 45 days. Raskob took New York's nickname, the Empire State, for his ambitious project. New York Governor Smith's grandchildren officially cut the ribbon on the building on the 1st of May 1931.
We are about to officially open the Empire State Building, the largest and most beautiful office building in the world.
With the city in the grip of the Great Depression at the time of its opening, the world's largest office building stood mostly empty for some time. Some locals derided it as the Empty State Building. It wasn't until the 1950s that the building became profitable, and it was sold in 1951 for $34 million.
Tallest of New York structures and the tallest in the world is the amazing Empire State Building. It has 7 miles of elevator shafts and 73 elevators, which travel so fast that a passenger entering one at the street floor may reach the 80th floor exactly 1 minute later.
By the end of 1980, its business success saw it given its own zip code, 10118. Few icons have become so inextricably linked with the building as the great King Kong and actress Fay Wray when the giant ape scaled it in the 1933 hit film.
You almost know it before you've even gone there because it's in so many films. You know, you can't think of King Kong, Sleepless in Seattle. There's so many others that will actually reference the Empire State Building as kind of to say you're in New York.
Most tourists come here for their first stop. You see the shape of the building and you know where you are, you know what it is.
Named one of the 7 greatest engineering achievements in America's history, the Empire State Building has been at New York's very heart, a beacon celebrating the 20th century in its very fibre. At the start of the 20th century, the British Empire was one of the strongest powers in the world. Nothing so dramatically illustrated its fall from power as a political disaster in 1956.
The Suez Canal is 160 kilometres long and it connects Egypt to the Red Sea. It's the shortest route between Europe and India and Australia.
Strategically important to Britain in both world wars and to the passage of oil to Western Europe, the British maintained a vast military garrison of 80,000 soldiers in the Suez.
All honour to every Briton now playing a part in keeping the canal open.
Egyptians resented the lingering colonial influence, with Britain and France remaining the largest shareholders of the Suez Canal. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser reached an agreement with Britain. British troops would withdraw from Egypt by June 1956, and Egypt would respect freedom of navigation through the canal. As the last British troops withdrew from the Suez Zone in 1956, relations between British Prime Minister Anthony Eden and Nasser were increasingly hostile. When Eden withdrew his commitment to supply military arms to Nasser, he responded by nationalising the Suez Canal and closing the Straits of Tehran to Israeli ships.
Now Egypt's President Nasser has made his grant for recklessly and illegally taking over the canal 12 years ahead of the agreed date to end the concession.
This was a violation of the Suez Agreement that Eden had personally negotiated. He tried to persuade the British public of the need for war.
True, it runs through Egypt, but it is not vital to Egypt, as it is to many other countries in all parts of the world. We cannot agree that an act of plunder, which threatens the livelihood of many nations, should be allowed to succeed.
France and Israel were also alarmed at Nasser's decision. At a secret meeting between the three countries, they planned a coordinated attack to seize back the canal zone.
Britain was determined to regain control of the canal, and the French were concerned about the canal because they didn't want Nasser's Arab nationalism to influence their colony in Algeria.
Israeli forces moved first on the 29th of October, invading and taking the Sinai Peninsula in 7 days. 2 days later, Britain and France began an aerial bombing campaign. The tripartite operation was a military success, but a political disaster.
Russians threatened to use every force necessary to stop the violence against the Egyptians, and which caused the British to back down and accept a ceasefire. The Americans in particular got very upset.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance.
In the face of intense international pressure, the invading forces withdrew just 8 days after the invasion had begun. The canal was closed to traffic for 5 months, with Britain having limited access to fuel and oil, leading to petrol rationing.
I think it destroyed English prestige in the Middle East and the career of Anthony Eden. After that, his prospects diminished. It was considered the last roar of the lion and the end of a colonial rule in Egypt.
Well, I think we're in a very serious predicament over the affair. I think we've done wrong.
Egypt was granted ownership and sovereignty of the Suez Canal by the United Nations. Nasser's standing in the region was now stronger. Anthony Eden resigned from public life, and for Britain the action was a failure that dealt a lasting blow to its world standing. In the 1970s, the makers of independent films dreamed small, took their creations to individual cinemas and crossed their fingers. But in May 1977, a film was released that provoked a reimagining of the entire film industry. Star Wars: A New Hope opened in cinemas on the Wednesday prior to the Memorial Day weekend in the United States, in a mere 32 cinemas. The movie by second-time director George Lucas was not expected to have further success.
The expectations were basically non-existent. 20th Century Fox basically were in disaster mitigation mode. They thought that it wasn't going to be successful, that they'd lost a lot of money, it had gone over budget.
Although the $11 million project was not popular amongst producers, it played very differently with the public.
The attendance at Star Wars has been almost astronomical. Queues are still forming.
The movie played for over a year, reaching 1,750 theatres. Its success was helped in part by its clever marketing. Lucas made a clever move. He opted to keep the marketing rights, shopping them around until they were bought for $100,000 by Kenner, and a lucrative partnership was born. The merchandising of the film earned more than its box office and started a marketing revolution.
The company that he engaged to sell Star Wars figurines were literally selling empty boxes with the promise that they would be filled because they couldn't manufacture toys fast enough.
Within 4 years, 40 million Star Wars toys have been sold, and new toys continue to be made, keeping public imagination active between films.
It entirely changed the way that Hollywood went about making money from ancillary products, from merchandising, from tie-ins, which was not the case before Star Wars. It's probably one of the film's biggest legacies.
Sequels followed, then prequels and TV series, and success that continued into the 21st century. The unexpected response to Star Wars has turned a film into a franchise, which would trigger the transformation of the film industry, standardizing and integrating marketing beyond the reach of an individual movie.
Star Wars is such a broad-based fantasy. There really is something for everyone. So, I fully expect that kids as well as collectors are going to continue to be as enthusiastic about Star Wars as they have been in the past.
Star Wars popularity has grown considerably since that first weekend, appealing to the new generation as much as it did to their parents.
And, it's something you pass down to your kids. My parents saw it as their first date. So, it was ingrained in my childhood.
I think Star Wars endures because it has such an appeal for everybody. There's a real basis in previously successful works of cinema, from Kurosawa to John Ford westerns to science fiction films and World War II films. It pulls you in and it offers such a wide range of viewers something to grab onto.
George Lucas built an empire out of his stories, impacting on everything they touched. From movies to toys, to music, to books, to games. Embedding a distant galaxy in the imagination of its audience, and animating the ancient mythic narrative of the hero's quest in a universal story that is still loved across the world today. It had been almost 20 years since the Great War, and Germany's leader Adolf Hitler was ready to present his country's new order of strength and prestige to the world. The Third Reich was determined that the 1936 event would be the biggest games yet.
And this is not a shot of aerial piracy over Wembley, but a bird's-eye view of the dress rehearsal at Berlin's Olympic Stadium, where the games are to be held.
The 1936 Berlin Olympics were better organized and a more grandiose spectacle than what had come before. And this is partly because the Nazi regime was very good at spectacle. They were very good at organizing things.
Germany was determined to show itself in its best light with a performance that would set the standard for every succeeding sporting event.
They also brought in new innovations. They invented the torch relay, the lighting of the torch in Olympia, Greece, and this sort of fictitious linking of ancient and modern Olympics.
A luxurious display was initiated, treating visiting countries to the best of everything Germany had to offer.
Members of Great Britain's Olympic team arrive in Berlin, where a warm welcome is extended them.
In the background, they hid their secrets. Before the visitors arrived, all media with anti-Jewish sentiments was toned down.
They even allowed 2 Jews to represent Germany on the German Olympic team. So there was a sense that they were trying to conceal the depth of the anti-Semitic discrimination and the discrimination against other groups, and to present themselves instead as a peaceful country.
Visiting countries were uneasy, and several considered boycotting the event for an alternate venue in Spain. But by the opening ceremony, there were 49 countries participating. Though Germany won the most medals over the 2 weeks, African-American Jesse Owens embarrassed the host country, winning 4 gold medals and making a mockery of Hitler's belief in superior Aryan genes. The stadium was packed with spectators for most of the events, and Hitler took the opportunity to display the discipline of the country's youth. In between events, they massed on the infield to perform the kinds of physical improvement that was mandatory in Germany.
Given that there was a very tight linking in those days between the physical fitness of a population and military preparedness, Germany's success in the Games should have been a signal that Germany was militarily prepared.
The need for able-bodied men in Germany to be in perfect physical condition is emphasized constantly by the government.
The Olympiad was filmed and viewing rooms were set up around the city. Hitler wanted his triumph to be known throughout Germany and all over the world, and he made sure the news travelled.
They see the charming incident of the presentation of a bouquet to the Führer by a little girl.
For the most part, they were praised and brought new legitimacy to the Nazi regime.
This had been a chance for the world to speak against the human rights issues playing out in Germany. But instead, the Nazi regime was legitimised by the attending countries' participation.
It's been taken to be a classic lesson in why you should not give the Olympic Games to a dictatorship. Because what the Olympic Games can do is offer legitimacy, strengthen domestic support, essentially give a dictatorship greater strength, greater ability to survive. And it's been used now continuously since 1936 as a lesson in why the Olympic Games really should be awarded only to democracies that respect human rights.